So actually, we're not here, remarkably enough, to watch us go through goodie bags. We're actually here to do our panel, which is about left brain plus right brain equaling engagement. Now, I was just discussing with the panelists beforehand, in case you're not sure which side of the brain does which, don't worry, we forget it as well. But left brain is for creativity, and right brain is more for logical activities. And in particular, we're going to try and talk and work out about how mobile gaming companies are going to work to fuse that creativity together with logic to try and create engaging experiences. Just to introduce myself, I'm George Osborn. I'm the event editor at Pocket Gamer Biz and general freelance writer, monkey person man. And instead of me introducing the panelists, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask them what their favorite game on mobile is that combines that creativity with that logical engagement to create a really awesome experience. So off you go.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Thomas. I'm the head of gaming at Immersion Corporation. Immersion is the leading provider of haptic technology. So we bring haptics, which is touch feedback, to gaming, automotive, wearables, all kinds of use applications. But today we're going to talk more about the gaming side. In terms of games that I think fuse left and right brain very well, I hate to kind of look at the charts, but I think often the charts do reflect those two elements working well together. The game that I look at primarily is Minecraft, which I think is such a creative application of a very robust technology platform. And the engagement level that people have with Minecraft, at least that my kids have, is just off the charts. I mean, they're so plugged into that game because of the creative crafting open world element that's built on this just amazing technical backend.
That's a pretty cool game. That is a cool game. I've spent hours in it too. My name is David Zemke. I'm a director of business development at DNA. And for those of you who don't know DNA, we're a gaming company. We're based in Tokyo, Japan. We're a very large gaming company. We've had several top 10 titles over the last couple of years. I'm glad to be on the panel because we're actually one of the few content providers on this panel, so it's kind of interesting. For my favorite game right now, I'm actually playing one that is currently in development, but you can play it here. It's a VR game, and it's called Protocol Zero, and we're working on it with a studio up in Canada. But what I like about it is that it gives you, when you put the VR goggles on, you actually feel this sort of intuitive sense of where you have to go within the game. And to me, that's actually very much a right brain element to it. It's sort of creative in how you solve each level. And you can try it. It's actually being played right now in the lobby, so go check it out.
So Jeff Drobick, I'm Chief Product Officer at Tapjoy. Nice to meet you guys. So Tapjoy is all about building platforms for monetization in freemium apps. And so, we're very heavy in gaming. I think they've been probably the largest segment that have adopted free-to-play and understand bridging content analytics and ultimately making money. And so, I'd say to answer the question on favorite app, Subway Surfers. I don't know how many of you guys know that app, but I love it. My daughter plays it with me, and they're really good at introducing new content, so new characters, new cities you're in, and recognizing, given the engagement you have in the app, how far into it, how often you visit, serving up other content that would reinforce that game experience. And so, that content could be a rewarded ad where you're going to earn and continue your lives, or other things in there. So I happen to like that one.
Fantastic. So my name is Jeff Cooper. I'm a senior manager of business development at Samsung. And I've taken a lot of hard look this last year, especially at wearables and how they can be incorporated into games. And even more recently, particularly for the show, I've focused on smart home. And I've also given some thought to how maybe even gaming can integrate with smart home. And so that's kind of an area I've been looking at, is how to incorporate new things, new technology to make the games even more enticing. As far as favorites, it's more of a class of games. I like games that typically allow you to solve problems, and it's fun at the same time, but there's an intellectual challenge to it. So that's kind of be what my preference.
That's cool. It's interesting because you've all come up with quite interesting selection of games, some of them from different angles, VR, Minecraft, obviously multi-platform. I was wondering, just to sort of throw this out to any of you feel free to jump in first. I was going to ask about why it's really important that you need to combine creativity with these kind of logical structures within a mobile game in particular. I mean, what is it about a mobile game that differs from, say, a game that's released on PC or console, and why does it really need this strong mixture of creativity and this whole logical underpinning to it.
Well, I'll jump in on that, and I think it's really the platform. It's kind of a limited platform. I mean, the screen size is small, the controller, is the screen. You don't have the same options and choices you have when you're designing a console or PC game. So you're constrained with your options. And I think that constraint actually is sort of the, mother of invention or creativity in a sense, because you have to think of new ways to approach gameplay, design narrative elements with games that you kind of globally localize, voiceover or that type of component is very hard, so you need to think of other solutions. So I think the platform in and of itself. Not working. Anybody hear anything I just said? I think the platform actually really demands creativity specifically.
I would just add that we don't see, from DNA's perspective, we're a free-to-play gaming company, and we don't see mobile as constraining, although I do see your point about it being something that sort of fosters creativity. We see it more as limitless, in that you've got a device now that has 10 times the power of a PC a couple years ago, and what makes it really interesting for us is when you achieve that balance of a right brain and left brain creativity, we like to kind of think of it as a Zen harmony where people are engaged in the game and they're using both sides of their brain in order to play it and keep engaged within the game, and that to us, is a certain level of success. So.
And what about you, Jeff? Because in particular, monetization, I think within mobile, it's one of these things that you really need a hardcore of data to it to succeed. I mean, is that really the case? Do you really need to underpin one of these games with this huge analytical framework?
Well, so the answer is yes. I think you clearly need analytics that are actionable, right, to be successful. And if success is growing your users and driving up engagement and then ultimately making money so that you can, reinforce that and launch more, then yeah, you've got to think about this up front. And the thing I would maybe disagree a little bit with is it's not a huge complex thing, quite honestly. If you pick a good platform that has great scalability in there, you integrate the SDK, you'll get the core KPIs you need to look at, and the question is taking action on that. And to me, the thing that's very, very important to think about is those actions. A few years ago used to be stuff in the game, in the virtual store, let's say, like buying goods and things like that. Okay, that's what we call in-app purchases. That was classically thought of as, okay, that's one stack of solutions and here's what you're going to do. And then, oh, there's ads over here. The reality is going forward, the leaders are looking at content and taking that content and showing it to the right user at the right moment. And that content could be a house ad for a cross promo. That content could be a new release of some, another player. The content could be a rewarded ad where you can bring that money back into the app. And so I just think it's really important to sort of think about that up front, but it's not necessarily complicated if you make some good choices.
Yeah, I completely. I mean, everything I've heard from talking to developers who've succeeded across the world, particularly the likes of Supercell, they made a very strong effort from the very beginning to make sure that they fed monetization into basically what they were doing. But at the same time, I mean, a lot of people, when they look at something like Clash of Clans, they look at it as a game and go, oh, it's very similar to other types of game, et cetera, et cetera. But when it came out, it took really interesting elements of the base building genre, combined it to real-time strategy, and then reconfigured it to really work in the free-to-play environment. And I guess this is the kind of thing about the creativity. They did something that was a little bit different, actually, in the end. It looks very formulaic now, but that's because everyone's copied it. So I was wondering about you, Jeff, because you were talking about wearables in particular. I mean, how important is creativity when you're coming towards the sort of selection of these games? I mean, developers, new platform, what do they do with it?
Well, I think to reinforce the point of the constraints on a device, when smartphones first came out, there was a tendency to think of them as mini laptops. And it took a while to sort of get that notion out of your head to realize the device can do different things. And because it's different, it can be moved around freely, it has location data. The same thing with the watch. It's not a phone on your wrist. Don't just think of it as just another screen, but think of it, how can I creatively use this to augment my game? I put a lot of thought into this last winter, with how can you use this to measure the motion in a game? If I'm doing a racing game, can I use it to accelerate and decelerate? It's on my wrist. The natural action in like a dirt bike, something like that. Can you just use it for that? Can I use it as a turbo boost as I'm doing something else? There's different uses like that. It can be used for workout applications, gaming type things. If you have, the number of popular games that help people get off their butts and get up and move around, you can actually measure that motion and record it into a health database that we now know this stuff's all becoming connected. Lately, I'm focusing on home automation. So if you're in a game and suddenly you end up in a red alert state, could you turn the lights in the house red so that you're now embedded into that environment of the game itself through the extension of the house? There's environmental controls. The player's getting overheated, let's turn the air conditioning down a little bit, it's getting worked up in that game. Or, echo the heartbeat back out over the speakers, to increase the intensity of the game if the person has a heart rate sensor on. We've got our sim band out here that has got an array of sensors. As those things become productized, I think that's another area that you could just and just open your minds up to what all things do we have on these endpoints. What can we use? What can we utilize? The gameplay may still be here, or it could be on the TV, or it could be both. There's just think about everything you have and how you can make it work together and create a new experience and extend, bring additional value, and you can even breathe new life into older titles that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff because I know that is pretty much kind of like the immersion mission statement, that kind of thing about creating those immersive experiences using something that's not quite so, something, say, in the broader environment. I saw you talking yesterday and you were talking about when people are using camera apps and you have that shutter sound to make sure that people feel sort of properly immersed in the experience of using it, even though obviously smartphone cameras don't have shutters. I mean, how does immersion go about creating and helping developers to create these engaging experiences?
Well, I mean, we are fundamentally a technology platform. I mean, we provide a technology solution that adds haptics to games to create really bring a third sensation into the experience. So it's not just visual, it's not just auditory. You can add touch as a component to just enhance the gameplay. But again, that's really built on a technical platform. So we really are working to take that one step further and engage with the development ecosystem to help them understand how to approach that from a creative perspective. The technology on its own is really sort of useless until it's put through a creative process and implemented creatively into the experience. So where to use haptics, how to implement them, which to choose, what events in the game best call for a haptic event. How can we take this technology and creatively apply it to the experience of the game to add immersion, to add engagement to the experience. And from what we've seen with the creative pipeline that we have in place and just working with our development partners is that when you actually engage in a creative process and you use analytics as part of your kind of feedback metric to help understand how players are responding, you can marry all of those components and really drive a much more engaging experience than you can isolated as just technology or just kind of a creative approach. You really have to put all the pieces together to get the full benefit of what the technology offers.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way that you and Jeff are you're quite complementing each other in that sort of that way that you're thinking so about this new platform, about coming up with innovative new ways of using something like, say, smart heating, as a way of deepening the experience, while at the same time you're talking about the fact that if you underpin this with analytics and work out the appropriate moments, then you can really create an engaging experience. And so this is pulling me round to David, because obviously Protocol Alpha, which I was playing earlier today.
Protocol Zero. Yeah.
Protocol Zero, sorry, I got it confused with another game with an alpha in it, I apologise for that. But essentially I was playing it earlier today and it was fantastic. It was a really immersive experience. But I was wondering about how DNA goes about combining that creative and analytical strands together, because obviously this is a new platform for you guys. I mean, how do you go about making sure that the creative team are coming up with really interesting ideas while the analytical team are making sure that the experience is really well suited to that platform?
Well, I think it starts at the design process, really, and that when you take a look at a concept of a game and you prototype something, we spend a lot of time looking at it from a holistic point of view of how do we delight our customers and how do we keep them coming back? And really, you take the basic building blocks of a tower defense game, for example, like a game like we just launched Star Wars Galactic Defense. And when we created that game, we wanted to have an experience which not only touched on some analytical pieces, which is how do I build my bases and lay them out, and then at the same time there's a right brain sort of piece which is more intuitive and creative, which is how do I lay these pieces out and what kind of base do I build using these structures? And the left brain piece is, well, which pieces have greater value? So we try to balance those elements, and for us, the delight comes from having an equilibrium of both pieces, and then you start to see people get more engaged. They start to use not only the the left brain side of how do I use these pieces, but then the right brain side of, well, how can I creatively lay them out? And a big part of the right brain stuff is really the social elements too. It's like, what can I do to create within the game to share with friends?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, Jeff, about that social element, I mean, how can developers go about, say, using analytics within their social elements to make sure that they're getting the most value from that really, I mean, quite essential area of user acquisition, I guess?
Yeah, so let's pretend we're all launching an app, and one of the first things beyond having the core architecture of the app, and I'm assuming it's a freemium app because that's the way to do it, one of the first things you've got to go figure out is how am I going to launch this? How am I going to acquire the users that are a good fit to that design and the genre? And that piece of it is really, really important. It's what Tapjoy does a ton of, but understanding the profile of your highest value users, the ones that are going to really be in there and visit 7 out of 7 days or 5 out of 7 days, that matters an awful lot. Why? Because they drive close to 70% of your revenue. So if you can apply the analytics to understand your most engaged users, the people that are repeat visit day 1 users or day 7 or day 30, you talk about retention, those kinds of pretty common practice analytic strategies, and then putting them into action and driving your user acquisition campaigns are very powerful. And so I think the first piece of how do you do it and the strategies would be make sure you're connecting the dots between understanding your core user base and engagement, and then driving that through your strategies on user acquisition. The second thing I was going to say is I think it's a mistake to think about monetization as being an erosion of the user experience. And so I mentioned earlier the older way to think of it was like in-app content and then ads, and then they were optimized separately. If you do it well, it's really content. And if you bring that content to the right moment in front of the user, it actually will drive up engagement. And there's a different publisher, Hothead Games, that we've worked with for years. They actually did a really good job introducing monetization, and because it's rewarded and it brings the user back to the app, not out to some other place and then you're gone, engagement actually went up. So on Android, they got 5 times lift in the day 1 through day 30 retention. So the important point there is I think if you can just connect the dots between what's happening in your app, make it very insightful, and then connect it to taking action, then what you really have is a nice flywheel working where engagement goes up.
I think I have a suggestion for you. I think you need to do a left brain, right brain KPI in your SDK. Yeah, some kind of a level to see which part of the brain you're using.
Exactly. Well, I mean, actually, that could just simply be a question out of interest to you guys. Anyway, I mean, what percentage left brain, right brain do you think the average mobile game needs to have? I mean, is it a 50-50 split, do you think? Or do you have to have is analytics more important for, say, a mobile game than, say, a console game? Would it be 60-40 for mobile and 30-70 for console? Or, I don't know. I mean, what do you guys think?
I would say look at the top 10 charts right now, because it's interesting when you break down different titles. You mentioned Clash of Clans, I think, early on, which to me is a great balance of a right brain, left brain experience. You're building these bases and you build them however you want. At the same time, you're really thinking strategically before you start the game of how you're going to go into battle, right? So you have that, then you have Candy Crush, which to me is more of a right brain experience. It's very creative and intuitive, and you sort of figure out how you want to solve the puzzle. Then you get into the casino apps, which to me are very left brain, right? It's very much an analytical, how am I going to win, how am I going to get coins? And then you get even farther down into like the Farmville style games, right? It's how do I build a farm, and that's a very right brain experience. So I think there's a blend, I think there's a blend. But if you can achieve a harmony to it, I mean, I think it doesn't hurt based on the level of success of the top 10 games, but, so.
There we go. Anyone wanting to disagree with that vehemently, or just chip in with their own thoughts?
I mean, I was feeling like some of your left versus right brain associations I would have reversed. Which I think is actually a little bit interesting. I mean, Candy Crush I actually feel like is a very technical game. I mean, it's beautiful and it's delightful, but the how many match 3 games have there been before Candy Crush came along? There's been dozens, hundreds probably, and yet nothing drove an experience and engagement the way Candy Crush did. And part of that was the saga component, which gave it a narrative story, which I think was a very brilliant addition to kind of a Bejeweled type of experience. But beyond that, there is just this sort of magic underneath the hood that's going on to drive engagement and to keep players coming back for more. And I think that's actually maybe more technical in its execution than just a visual sort of creative experience. Although the art direction and the art execution and the visual aesthetic is beautiful. It's very delightful to experience.
No, and I think, I'm going to go back and challenge you again and just say, if you think about the definition of left brain, which is analytical, logical, it's more detail-oriented. This is based on the classical psychology theory, right? And then right brain is more intuitive, gut reaction, emotional aspect. And so I think what makes Candy Crush so addictive is you have that balance. You've got a saga map, which you can again see where you're at, and that's more of a technical piece, like you said. And then when you get into the game and you're actually playing, it's part of just the delight of how those pieces all fall together and explode and make power-ups. And so I think it's the balance of the two.
I agree. I actually think Candy Crush is maybe one of the best games to point at as that kind of perfect marriage, where the endpoint is right in between the spectrum. You know, Minecraft, which I mentioned earlier, I think actually leans more heavily in the technical world. I mean, you know, visually it's not very exciting, but the creative components, the creative possibilities are huge. But again, that's more of a technical sort of process, or technically enabling the player versus playing more to just the intuitive aspects.
But I think what I wanted to comment on is, getting back to your original question, George, I think this is a really good example of best leading games that have applied social, whether it's sharing or bringing in your network and accessing data that's there to bring virality into the game and drive growth. And so I think, you know, the titles you guys rattled off were, you know, leaders in that field for sure, without question. And so I think that just has to be part of how you think about your strategy of acquiring users and driving engagement, and then growing it out when you're building it out.
And I think too, you know, from a social viewpoint, that games, obviously Candy Crush being online, there was, you know, you had the social element, but I think a lot of games can be, you know, somebody just beat your high score, you know, it could be any game, and challenge you to come back to it. You know, you may think you finished the game and you've done a good job, you've done as good as you're going to get, and then somebody, your best friend, comes and beats your score a month later. Now it's like, I got to go back in and try to get better.
That's an emotional reaction, right?
Yeah, it's emotional, get you back into it.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. But quite a lot of this is also based upon just a deeper understanding about the way that people play and what hooks them back in. So you were mentioning about the fact that when you play a game like Candy Crush Saga for a long time, you start getting that flow to it. And I mean, I think it is actually a psychological concept, this idea of flow, particularly among sportsmen. So when you look at someone like, say if you're watching tennis and you're watching someone like Roger Federer play, because he's practiced so much throughout his life and he's managed to master this skill, that essentially he plays in a completely different rhythm to other players, that he actually ends up playing tennis in a way that's so effortless. So, you know, when you see him sort of hit a forehand winner, he just knows how to do that his brain has literally been retuned and rewired to mean that he does that. And when you see someone like Roger Federer, if you see him having a bad day, the reason why he's having a bad day is because the psychological wiring in his brain has actually sort of started telling him he's going through the motions of trying to hit the ball properly, when actually he can subconsciously do that. And so I don't really know where I'm going with that. I just thought it was a particularly interesting little thing. But I mean, I guess we could say, but I mean, talking about creative experiences, like, I mean, Jeff, have you got any ideas about how you can make sure that you maybe take on board that idea of people going forwards and wanting to master something and get better, but also managing to present, you know, future challenges to them? How do you maybe go about doing that?
like I said, the social element, just wanting to be the best in your group is a huge compelling. Beyond that, you know, improve the game and release additional, more complicated levels to it, and so forth. But I also think that the type of platform that you're on also, the types of games can be different depending on the platform. Obviously, you have some games that are on console and mobile. You have a lot of them that are on both, but then sometimes mobile has its own moments, you know, spare time, frivolous waste of time, whatever. People, look at Flappy Birds just took off, and, you know, and it's just, you know, it was a time killer, and it was insanely challenging at the same time. And so, you know, it just depends on the platform as to what works. So,
I love the fact that we can still bring up Flappy Birds in a panel. You know, it just never goes away.
Oh, exactly.
but it's an example of just something contextual for the platform that it was on.
Now,
So-
I would add to that, to answer your question too about flow and about how it fits with the left and right brain thing. When we design games at DNA, we look at it from a perspective of always wanting to make sure that the user has some sort of emotional attachment. And we've actually built games and we've got analytics in place which tell us when a user is doing particularly well or not so well. And so we're able to engineer the games and create the games so that you achieve a certain flow and harmony. So when you beat a boss level and then you get the ability to level up or power up your character, that gives you a certain reward and a feeling of goodness about the game, then that you're likely to come back in and play again. And it gets a little easier for a while because of that level up. But then we want to increase the level of difficulty just a little bit more. And so what we see a lot of times with player behavior is that, you know, again, there's like a slight ramp up and then a little bit down, and then up again, and then a little bit down. And so you kind of create this wave of engagement that continues on and on.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the same thing as well I heard from one of the guys at King when they were talking about Candy Crush Saga. There was I think it was the notorious, I think it was level 56, which was basically the sadistically hard level. And what would happen was that they would sort of, the difficulty would be like that, and then it would go up sort of slightly at level 28, and then it would go back down, and then it would come back up, and then it would reach this sort of massive peak, and then it would come back down again and go up like that. And by doing that, they had this real curve so that when players, either say they shared to help get more lives, or they bought something to basically unlock the level, or to get past the level, they then got into a nice sort of curve afterwards, so they basically didn't feel like they'd wasted their money, or they didn't feel like they wasted their time. Yeah. Exactly. And I guess this is feeding into something else about the fact that we're talking about the left brain, right brain side of game design, but there's also the left brain, right brain side of the user and how they're adapting to the fact that free-to-play is a different model. I mean, anyone in here see South Park recently? Anyone heard about South Park free-to-play stuff?
That's a great episode.
Exactly. It's a fantastic episode, but it was very interesting because they were saying, oh look, we only monetize 1 to 5% of our user base, and it's just like, that's the whole thing, is like we get people to spend loads and loads of money and ha ha ha. But it's like when you actually look at monetization on the web, with free applications such as Skype or Dropbox, you see a similar thing, that maybe sort of 5% of the user base is actually monetized and pays. So do you have to, when sort of looking at things like monetization and marketing, do you have to treat users differently in relation to the fact that with a free-to-play game, it's not so much in this old product model, but maybe it's more towards this games as a service idea? I mean, does that sort of affect the way that users behave and how you have to treat them?
Well, I'll give my part of the answer. You absolutely need to understand that there's a very big concentration, right, in the users that are willing to spend real dollars, right, and there's users that are not. And our data shows that it's actually really concentrated. So in gaming, we talk about whales and dolphins and interesting things on there, but that's less than typically 2% of your daily active users. And so if you're really good at acquiring more of those users of that profile, lookalike users, then fantastic. Your efficiency of spend to acquire highly engaged users is very effective, but not everybody is, right? And so how do you make sure that for the 2 or so percent that are driving most of your direct in-app purchase revenue, they're well taken care of, they're happy, they're not churning and lapsing, right? And then what do you do with the other, let's say 90 to 95% in the middle that really haven't gone to and experienced any kind of ads or rewarded, and they're just in there? And so I think if you can actually unlock some value and connect those users more deeply in your store, in different areas of your game, your engagement will go up and your monetization will go up. And so from my view, I just think you've got to really pay very close attention to what's happening. And we talk about these frequency of users, like in a week, how many days do you come back? Are you a 1 in 7? Are you a 5 in 7 day? Are you a 7/7? And really understanding. And the mistake that a lot of app developers will make is they'll just look at the total number. So they'll look at my total daily active users, is it growing? Then great, I'm in good shape. When the reality is, if you really started to segment those users down, you might have some unhealthiness in the app architecture, whether it's level difficulty or issues, or maybe your user acquisition strategy, right, where you're acquiring the wrong kind of users that are going to churn and leave easily. So I just think it sounds like a lot, but if you really bring it all together in a nice place, then you can align your user acquisition strategy with your game architecture, and you can ultimately drive money.
What do you make of that, David?
No, I mean, I would agree. We look at 1 day and 3 day and 7 day retention, and even 30 and 60 and 90. We go as far out as that just to see how people are playing the game and what kind of hurdles they are encountering, and we try to fix things to make sure that they're engaged and enjoying the games. It really comes down to just primarily building a really good product, a really good game, and an experience that people want to play again and again and again. And then the analytics part of it is important because that tells you about what your users are doing. And then it gives you the keys to kind of go back in and figure out what to fix and improve on.
Yeah, exactly. You've got the obvious disadvantage within mobile that you've got this huge, massive audience, which is great, and there are people playing all over the world, but you can't see what they're doing unless you've got this analytics. Like, you're not able to look over their shoulder and go, oh, they're struggling on that level without the help of that. It's kind of your ability to check to see whether your game's, pushing the boundaries too much, perhaps, or causing problems. But I was wondering as well with Jeff over there about the creativity, about these new experiences. Like, I mean, you guys were mentioning churn and the fact that huge numbers of people, even in a very strongly performing free-to-play game, you'll expect to see a lot of people download the app and go, bored of it within a day and just get rid of it. I mean, how do you go about creating new and interesting gaming experiences to try and make sure that you keep as high a percentage of those people as you can? I appreciate that is possibly the multi-billion-dollar question, and that if you can answer that, then off you go and make your billions. But, you know, any insight into that?
Now, I think several things. I think being able to experiment with your game to see what increases the user engagement and the analytics that comes back to the developer, to the game, the game developer, to understand what features being used, what particular, as you said, the problems they're encountering. Do they prefer, if it's a, which type of weapons they prefer they use more of, which ones they're not. Maybe you can refine it, tinker around with different scenarios, and try out different things to improve your game in the early days to help craft a hit. And I think that's one way that you can use. That lets you be a little more risk taking. And and get real data back to see which ones, because when you're creative, sometimes you'll create something you think's just really out there, and it can be a great idea, or it can be a complete dud. So I think just getting that feedback, understanding what your users are doing, can help you go off in the right direction.
Exactly, and I mean, you're talking there about great ideas that are dud. Supernauts by Grand Crew. I don't know if any of you played it last year. It was the Minecraft game, which was basically themed around Minecraft, but it was free to play. It was very heavily touted in the industry as the future of the free to play industry, and look, it's going to be the next multi-billion-dollar success. Came out this year, flopped, massive, complete and total and utter flop. And they seemed to do everything right. They did a soft launch, and they did quite a long soft launch, and came up with the data, and they were looking at the data. And it seemed to be that it was in soft launch for ages. And from what I heard from various people sort of around it, the data wasn't working for the game, and yet they launched it anyway. And it's kind of like, so in that sense, I mean, this is kind of leading into a question. It's just like, if you spent 3 months working on this game idea, or you spent 6 months, maybe you spent a year on this idea, you love it, and you're attached to it, and your analytics say it isn't working, what do you do?
Well, I'll give my piece of it. It's all about the test and learn philosophy around it. So, the notion of fail fast. So get something on the market, try it, refine it, scrap the stuff that doesn't work and refine it. I mean, that's core to the game development piece. And, again, to have great platforms like Tapjoy or otherwise to help you do that is key. And I think, DNA, you guys should talk about, the approach on it. But that's probably part and parcel of your whole development cycle.
So one of the tenets of our design right now is that we want to be agile and quick. And so we spend time prototyping games and designs. And if the data comes back and it doesn't work, then we don't see it as a failure. We see it as we know that we may not launch that game, right? But you have to be brave enough to say, no, that's not going to work. Let's kill it. Let's take the loss and move on. What's interesting is that I'll share a story that one of my coworkers shared with me when she went to Japan, was that she met several game designers when she was over there, and they would introduce themselves and say, hi, I'm Yuji, I work on this product X, and it was a failure, but I'm learning and moving on. And so a big part of that is to accept the idea that you might have a failed idea, but whatever you did with that idea, you can now apply into your next game. So there's really no failure in that. It's more of a brave act to say, all right, I don't think this is really going to work, but what am I going to take from this to apply to game 2 and game 3 and game 4? Because there is always some key nugget of learning there.
Yeah, I know Supercell have parties when one of their games fail. So they have a variety. I mean, their name is derived from the fact that they work as small cells of teams. They produce game ideas. Then after a certain period of time, they go and give the idea to the rest of the team, and the team goes and plays around with it. And if it works, then they go on and produce it as a full game. And if it doesn't work, then they stop development on it and have a big party as the whole company come together, drink some booze, and they start again on the next idea. And actually, if we're talking about this sort of new way of approaching this kind of right brain approach to free-to-play game of test, iterate, and see perhaps whether or not it's working, I think it's really interesting to, look at someone like Supercell and say, maybe they've got the right idea here. But do you want to add something?
I mean, just since we're on this analytics sort of topic here, one of the things that we're finding really interesting.
Wait, we're rightly and breathly, and this is not analytics, right?
Well, it's the whole package.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And we're really tying everything together here. And what we're finding that's really interesting with haptics, I mean, haptics are a brand new feature. It's something that people, we're kind of aware of it, but it's really quite new to the gaming ecosystem. And so the analytics come in a very curious and interesting way, which is that people are sort of compelled and excited by it. But where we're seeing the most uplift is actually when you take it away, not when you give it to them. So when you give it to them, it shows up as sort of a neutral. I mean, people are delighted and surprised by this new feature. But where we're really seeing data is when you actually take it away as a feature, and it's sort of like this negative space, which is part of where we're learning, versus it just being this, do you give them something and get what you expect back or not, and then you kind of check that box. So for us, it's, I guess, one step more complex because it's this new feature. We're kind of introducing haptics as part of the experience, and so people have to adjust. There's a mental process of kind of becoming familiar, developing an expectation, developing a relationship to the haptic experiences that you're feeling. And almost a lexicon is being developed of, what physical events do I associate with what visual or emotional events within the game. You make those associations, and then when they're gone, there's a loss. There's a lack. It's almost like if you're used to an Android tactile keyboard and you pick up a non-tactile keyboard and use it, it feels weird. It doesn't feel like you expect it to. And so trying to measure negative data in that way is actually really interesting for us and somewhat challenging because it's more of a reaction than being proactive.
It is really interesting as well to hear about this different way. The fact that you're coming up with this practical thing about having to come up with the, dealing with this negative language, you have to come up with this new framework for working out this analytics, working out what it means. And I think it feeds into something else really, which, talking about the practical elements of it. Imagine that, someone in this audience, maybe they're developing a free-to-play game and they've got this idea and they're thinking, okay, they've talked a lot about analytics and they've said this is really important for making sure your gameplay works as well as it can, making sure you acquire the right users, making sure you monetize. So I guess the question has to be, how do you effectively go about setting that up for an app? What do you have to do to make sure that you've got the right framework to give yourself the best opportunity perhaps when you're beginning and starting out to make sure that you know that important information? I guess I'll start with you, Jeff, because I'm guessing you...
Well, let me, if it's okay, can I expand the segment outside of gaming, right? And so gaming, I think, largely as an industry has pioneered this and figured it out really well, and it really created free-to-play that we now call freemium. But outside of that, there's a lot of content players, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, so whether you're in that space, communications apps, they're all looking at premium content and saying, okay, well, if I want to have a micro content unlock, how might I do that? Right, and maybe it's a cooking app you're in, and we were talking earlier about, wouldn't it be great when the smart home has, stuff in your kitchen and your supplies of spices and things, and how would you make that work? But what about your recipe, right? And so there are a number of, even outside of gaming, services that are taking premium content and they're trying to say, let's forget this hurdle of $5 per issue or something like that. Let's make it a micro content unlock. How would you actually do that? And so for me, the key things you need to think about is, all right, well, what does the consumer really want, right? And it's some kind of premium content. Then the second thing I would look at is, all right, well, how can I enable and unlock that? Is it minutes of reading something? Is it, I've got a virtual currency, some coins, and I'm playing through and I'm burning that down? You've got to kind of think about that architecture a little bit. And then beyond that, there are some pretty basic tactics you'd apply on that, right? There's IAP, in-app purchase. There's a storefront. There's some cart and some things you do there. There's a way to earn through a Tapjoy or other solution where you can earn that currency. So I think there's some basic methods that if any of you guys in the audience really want to get into it, happy to talk to you about it afterward. I'm sure all of us would. But I just think there's some core things you want to think about in the app architecture, and then the technology choices you make that will make it a heck of a lot easier. And then beyond that, I think it's getting to the game production and all the the right brain stuff of great content, great experience, make it engaging, test and learn, all the things we were just talking about.
Well, exactly, and I think it's about coming up and understanding that architecture and understanding that even within gaming or outside of it, there are ways that you can make this successful, and there are ways to make it work and to learn how to make it work. But I was just going to sort of throw over to Jeff Cooper over there as sort of, I think we're going to ask two more questions and then open up for the rest of the audience. But it was more about, we've spoken a lot about that right brain logical side to it. So in terms of this left brain creative stuff, particularly you've been looking a lot at wearables and looking at these this new frontier, I guess. Mm-hmm. And how do developers go about getting themselves into the mindset so that they can design successfully for, say, a new platform or something completely different? How does someone go from developing, say, a successful app to developing something that's a successful app for a wearable? What do they have to do differently, and how can they transport themselves into a mindset to do that well?
That takes, it's difficult.
It's a Zen journey. You know?
Yeah, it's difficult. I was actually on a panel a couple weeks ago, and I had to think about an enterprise application in a wearable. And specifically, it was SurveyMonkey. It was at the Dreamforce. And I was like, well, first off, I do not want to answer 20 questions on my watch. I mean, so I had to, and I think what I actually did was go for a hike in the woods for a while. I lived down in Santa Cruz. I went out in the mountains and just hour and a half hike. But in that time period, I was able to kind of just get out of the four walls, stop thinking about 20 questions on my wrist, and start thinking about context of data. It has sensors, it has UV, it has motion, it has heartbeat, it has all sorts of sensors. It's also data that could be captured. And so there's all kinds of use cases. So look at what are the capabilities of what you're going on. Look at the raw capabilities. Look at every single one of them and think, how would I use them, and write down those ideas. Just wherever you are, whether you are in your four walls or you go out in the wilderness somewhere, write them down, think about how could this be used. And forget about the convention of I'm taking this and stuffing it on here. How would I use it? How can I use both? And how can I just really, you have to free think for a while about it. And you're going to have absurd ideas that just don't work, but one or two of those may stick. And so you just have to, it's tough. Getting creative, it's not a logical thing. No. So you just have to get away from convention and try to, there's no one single way. It's not a magic formula.
Yeah, I would agree that creativity is not something that comes inherently very easily, but one of the things that's important is to try to foster that and like take some time outside. Or one thing we do is we always have game jams at our company where we'll set aside all of the work we're doing, and literally the whole company will divide into teams, and we just brainstorm and come up with games, and we're given 24 hours to have an idea ready and prototype it, and then we share with the execs. And some of the ideas that actually come out of those end up being real games. But the idea is to kind of clear your head and think creatively about what kind of experience you want to build, and then build it
Keep
from
the
there.
pad of paper by the bed.
Okay, so we've got pads of paper, going for a walk in the forest, game jams. What's your creative idea? I guess?
I mean, for me, it actually opens up a different question, which is, in the creative process, how comfortable are we challenging our users and creating sort of friction in trying to introduce something new, be it a mechanic, be it, converting something to a wearable application. I mean, there's a certain amount of learning that we have to push players towards. A match 3 game like Candy Crush is, it's been around for ages, so it's pretty easy to put that in front of people and have an intuitive experience. But what are the burdens put on the people who are designing new mechanics and trying to introduce those and testing and getting analytics again, where maybe there's a learning curve involved, and maybe there is some kind of higher demand or expectation on the players in order to push them into some new experience. And part of the creative process, the right brain equals left brain. For me, one of the fundamental questions are, how much can we push people forward when the immediate reaction might not be so favorable because it's an acquired taste, or it's like one of those. I mean, for me, it's like music. For me, some of my favorite albums are albums that I didn't like at first, and I had to hear them again and again and again before I really started to understand why they were so expressive or why it was such a sort of magical piece. And if I had just made a determination based on, analytics or just a kind of a gut reaction from that first experience, I wouldn't have listened to it again. But I'm really glad that I, for whatever reason, kept listening to get over that point of conversion to really kind of falling in love with it. And I think that's a really actual central challenge to everything that we're trying to do. It's central to our work because we're introducing something brand new, and it is new, and it's inherently challenging because I would argue everything new is challenging in a sense. So again, how that shows up as data is also, you have to be a little careful because it can be misleading. Because again, when you take it away, you actually see that there was benefit. When at first, your results may be more confused. Yeah.
So in terms of getting past that friction for the players, unfortunately, you can't send them on a walk through the forest. You've got to just sort of try and help them out. That's I think pretty much where I'm gonna round it off there and just let some audience questions instead. So instead of us going along, has anyone got a question for the panel? I don't know if there are any others. Anyone? Go on. You can put your hands up. It's okay. Go on. There's a hand, hooray! I think someone's just gonna wander over with the mic because it's being recorded, and now there's a weird sort of. that's good. So yeah, so if you say whether you think you're left brain, so a bit more creative, or right brain before you answer, that'd be great. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. Well, we'll say that when the microphone comes across. There we go. You think you have both? I only have one half, you know.
So yeah, both sides of the brain, with an effort to keep that together, right? Is it David?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't come in the beginning.
Jeff.
So
you're 50-50 if you go with a Jeff on either side.
All right, Jeff. The forest hiking example I really like. Nature represents to me a part of this general topic of dualities here, right? Combining two things: nature versus man-made environments, right? Human-made, artificially.
Yeah.
Right. So. I guess your point was that it is restorative and creative or inspiring, right? That environment?
Yeah, the mind gets cluttered. When you're sitting there answering emails or,
Right.
online, for me, my job, I do a lot of email. I work with a lot of, I'm a partner manager, so I work with a lot of different companies. And I spend a lot of time going to all of them, and I'm having to shift context all the time.
Right.
And that clutters my mind. And so if I need to break free and think creative, I've got to get away from it. And so maybe sometimes it's just an hour.
Right.
But it's just to declutter the mind and kind of allow the thoughts to flow.
So this is what neuroscientists call directed attention fatigue, right?
What's that?
Directed attention fatigue.
Yes.
And there are findings that nature can restore that. So here's my extra question. Since we're talking about video games and artificial, like synthetic environments, right? If you were about to go hiking and that natural environment is made out of very obvious discrete elements, like triangles, do you think that would still work?
Are you talking about a virtual world? It could, if that's what inspires you and gets you at peace and lets you, if you find it inspiring, whatever works. It could be going to the living room, putting on a pair of headphones and turn out the world and listening to your favorite music. It's just something to kind of allow your brain to flow. It doesn't have to be the real world. If it's a virtual world, that's fine. It's whatever it takes to just for you to relax, and
Right.
I think that works. So
I'm thinking Harvest Moon. I don't know if any of you guys have played Harvest Moon. The farming, Nintendo farming stuff. You just go off and you just go and grow some crops for half an hour. That's kind of like off you go, do that, go down the shop, buy some seeds. There's nothing wrong with that. That's quite a nice way of spending a bit of time. But I think we're kind of out of time, unfortunately. Oh, have we got one more question? Yes. Let's go for one more, and then.
I just couldn't help but feel that the definitions around left brain, right brain, I think a lot of people came in with different expectations, and everyone has sort of their own interpretations. But it seems like there's been a pretty big association with left brain logic, right brain creative. Left brain being more kind of cold and objective, right brain being more emotional. But wouldn't you say, if you look at something, say like the Socratic method, which is a framework of logic, which spawned an immense creative output in Greece and throughout the world, that these are actually like so intertwined that they're not actually like separated in a way. They're sort of feeding back. And when we look, there's a lot of discussion here about analytics, game mechanics, analytics, game mechanics, analytics, game mechanics. And I think the closest thing I heard to like, all right, well, how does this relate to us? It was some of the relationships with levels, difficulty within, like, say, Candy Crush. I mean, that was like the one example. I was like, okay, there's something. I was wondering if you guys could maybe dive a little deeper into that world, because I was hopeful because I heard some stuff around like casino and gaming, and I think that's a great example, because if you look at the psychology of a gambler, he, in his mind, thinks he's logically working towards a win. In his mind, logically, like, he thinks he's using logic, but it's the emotion, there's this emotional element which keeps him constantly, willing to bet more, even though logically, if you really look at the numbers, the odds are against him. But for some reason, he convinces himself that there's a logical path to victory, despite the odds always being against him. So I was wondering if you guys had any more detailed or like kind of deeper examples in this area when we kind of look at sort of that left-right brain interplay and what you guys have seen. Because I think a lot of the stuff we look at and we're hearing about is analytics, great, in-app. You see what someone's doing. Are there other KPIs that you guys are seeing out there? Other inputs that you guys are looking at?
I could actually take that for a start. I don't know if this is still on, but oh, okay. So there's a little story in this one, and traditionally with DNA, we started out building what I would call very analytical and logical games that were card battle games. So to touch on your point, you're building a deck in order to battle friends, right? And so you're thinking very clearly and analytically about which cards you want to lay out. And what we've noticed, and this is really not a KPI or an analytic piece, but was that two things. One was that people play the game a lot and stayed engaged with it, but what really drove sales of other cards was the best looking art, and that's actually much more of a creative gut reaction piece. We noticed, like, we'd make these amazing cards with good art, and so that was nothing that we found analytically. It was just, wow, all of a sudden the sales of the great, the really beautiful cards drove engagement, and that was more of a right brain thing. And the second thing about that was we noticed also that early on in the game development and in the launch of the game I'm talking about, it's a game called Hellfire. We had built in some tools for social sharing, but what we really found was that fans were going outside of the game and creating guilds and groups on their own. And so this was more of an emotional attachment. They were actually like doing chats and things like this on websites about which cards they had and which guilds they were in. And this was created totally on their own. It's very much a user-generated thing. And so we looked at that and we're like, wow, that's amazing. Because again, this is a very analytical game, but we had not necessarily built the right tools for PvP or for team building. But people were doing this all on their own. So they were engaged on a certain level of how to win the game, but then they were also like, wait, I want to do this with other people, and that's more of a right brain piece. So it's been interesting to see that happen, and it's not something that always comes up in the analytics. And so getting back to your point of how the two work together, I mean, it's really important to look at it from a holistic top-down point of view, which is you can engage people in certain ways, like you said, about having an emotional and gut reaction, but also there's that analytical piece, and how the two work together is where you see some amazing results, and they don't always show up in hard data. So.
And I think the right brain has multiple aspects to it. There's emotion, which, there's happy, angry, excited, thrilled. There's also the creativity, either in you, the developer, to create something, or the appeal to the creative side through art, through the renderings, through how it looks. So, and you get an emotional response from that, but the creative, the ability to appreciate art tends to be more right, but you have emotion and you have creativity that are in that right, and then the left is the logic, and they do interplay, they ping pong off each other. I like to play Boggle with my wife in the evening, so it's just a word game. But there's logical, there's left brain, there's word lists. Right brain is the pattern, seeing them in zigzag patterns. Something simple like that, but it engages both half. They have to work together to actually play the game. So I think there's a lot of interplay.
Yeah, I think just as one sort of extra thing, that's just come to mind, and I've just remembered. There's a guy called Oscar Clarke who's written a book called Games as a Service. And I was talking earlier about the Candy Crush Saga thing, about the difficulty level kind of peaking and then sort of going into a bit of a plateau and then coming back up. And he explained that in a really interesting way, because he's been working in mobile monetization for quite a long time, and he basically looked at it from a psychological perspective. And people who spend money on in-app purchases, they have a form of buyer's remorse. So even if it's someone who regularly buys in-app purchases, after they've bought an in-app purchase, they will have an initial period afterwards in which they've bought it, they thought that all of their problems were going to be solved by this in-app purchase, they've solved their problems, and they're like, I've spent that now. And so they have this little initial moment afterwards where they do have that little bit of buyer's remorse. And so if you look at it in the context of what King are obviously doing with Candy Crush Saga, someone buys, they presumably get past the level that they're struggling with, and in that little zone where they're having buyer's remorse, they lower the difficulty level. And so the plateau comes down, and I'm assuming that the way that this works is the idea is that basically it sort of lessens the remorse. Someone gets past it, and then they progress, and they feel happier, and they come through to the other side again. So, in terms of this, I'd recommend, checking Oscar's book out. I'd also check out Eric Seffert. He's written a very good book about freemium economics. And then just in general, just go and look at things if you are looking at sort of monetization and from a psychological perspective. Deconstructor of Fun, it's a very, very good blog that also helps out on that. And of course, Pocket Gamer Biz. Hey, there we go. And on that note, I think we're going to finish the panel. So if you could all give everyone a round of applause for their time, that'd be grand.
All right. Thanks.